Hey, so I've had a request to do something on Christianity, gender and sexuality. And I thought about what would be best because the thing is, this did come up last year. So on the 2022 paper, there was a question on Hamson and Ruther and a question on celibacy and marriage. So, I mean, I don't want to make predictions because what I thought was going to come up on paper one didn't. I was wrong about that. I thought this might be a shout though, because ordination of women hasn't come up that often, I don't think, and it certainly wasn't there last year. So let me take you through this 15 marker, this AO2, and see what you think. It's as good a way as any to revise, to look at essays. Okay, so first thing to say is normally in my 15 markers, in my AO2 essays, I don't bother with an introduction because I think they're quite often not really saying anything and they're just wasting time. So quite unusually for me, I have done a little kind of introductory paragraph here, but I hope in a minute you'll see why I've done it, because I'm using it to try and signpost what my conclusion is. If you're going to do an introduction, make sure it's got AO2 content in it. So the ongoing debate refers to the fact that there is still division and disagreement in the church about the ordination and leadership of women, even though women have been ordained as priests in the Church of England since 1994 and as bishops since 2015. Now, to be honest, guys, if you wanted to lose that bit, I think you could. It's probably a little bit more AO1 than AO2. I've put it in here to kind of set the context, but I don't think it's necessary. You could just go straight in with this next bit, or even start with the next paragraph. See what you think. Whilst many would argue that there are valid theological reasons not to ordain women, I would argue that the ongoing debate shows that there is deep-rooted sexism in Christianity to this day. So I'm laying my cards on the table right at the top and saying I'm going to conclude that the statement is correct. So you can do that. It's a good strategy if you get an essay like this where you feel like your view is very, very clear cut, because then it can help you stay on track throughout the essay. But it's up to you. Everyone's got a different style of writing these. There are always lots of routes through a 15 marker and through a dialogues, so this is not prescriptive. This is just how I've done this one. Okay. Some in the Church of England argued against the ordination of women, claiming that it was out of step with the structures of the early church and went against the instructions in the Bible, particularly in 1 Timothy 2, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. Their argument is that the church today should reflect the church as it was in the early years of Christianity, and it should not try to move with the times, as this will damage its authenticity. I find fault with this argument because there are clear examples of women being given leadership responsibility in the early church. For instance, Phoebe, whom Paul commends to the Romans as a deacon of the church in Kencray. The fact that Paul gives Phoebe the job of interpreting his letter to the Romans shows that women must have been leaders in the early church. I find it more likely that women's leadership was prevented by men in the early church who saw them as a threat, and this seems a clear example of sexism rather than any kind of real theological objection. The fact that many opponents of women's ordination insist that passages like 1 Timothy 2 are important without referring to a wider context suggests that their motivation is simple sexism. So that's a long paragraph, and at the top of it I have had to outline a little bit of knowledge, but I'm doing it so that I can then be clear about what I'm criticising. So it's important to get the balance. Don't go mad with description because that's going to be AO1. So I've done it as sparely as I can here. I've done it as I've kept it as short as I can. But you can see I'm using phrases like this one here. I find fault with this argument, and also I find it more likely. So that proves that I'm engaging with the argument. And you know, there's sexism in the question, so there's sexism in my answer here. So that's my kind of opening paragraph that's got a big chunk of AO2 in it. Let's move on. However, and I'm starting with however because I'm responding to the previous paragraph, this may be unfair to the Church of England as a whole, because there was a great deal of joy when the first women were ordained, and there are now more female ordinands, which are ordination candidates, than male, which suggests that most in the Church of England have accepted and embraced women as leaders. On the other hand, the Church still allows individual congregations to reject the authority of female bishops and will provide provincial episcopal visitors or flying bishops. I understand why this provision exists, because without it the Church would not have been able to ordain any women bishops at all, but I still find it hard to accept that true equality has been achieved if a woman's authority can be rejected simply because she is a woman. So that's commenting on the fact that even though women can now be bishops in the Church of England, individual communities don't have to answer to them if they don't feel they can, or if it doesn't align with what they think theologically. And if that's the case, the Church of England will provide a male bishop for you. Now, that's a compromise, and it had to be a compromise, which I've acknowledged here, because otherwise it would never have happened at all. But the fact that that's even necessary possibly smacks of sexism. There is another side to the argument, and here it is. Anglo-Catholics would respond to this by saying that objections to women's ordination are not sexist, but rather it's a theological issue. Women's ordination is impossible because of the nature of the apostolic succession. So when I say Anglo-Catholics, just to be clear, I'm talking about people in the Church of England who share a lot of theological common ground with the Catholic Church. And these quite often are people in the Church of England who aren't down with the idea of women's ordination, but they say it's not a sexist thing. An analogy that I've heard used is, it's not that we're saying women shouldn't be priests because they're lesser. We're saying they can't be priests because that's not in the nature of being a woman. It's a bit like saying, it's not sexist to say that a man can't give birth. And we need to make this about the apostolic succession. They argue that Jesus' choice to have only male apostles must have been deliberate, but that this does not diminish the status of women. It simply means that they have different roles. This is known as complementarianism, and I find this unconvincing. So I'm laying out what it is, but then I'm kind of putting the boot in to say that I don't think it's a very good argument. It is not clear at all that Jesus intended for only men to be disciples. In the Great Commission, which is like his final instructions to his followers, he says, make disciples of all nations, but does not mention gender at all. I think it is more likely that the patriarchal structures from the society of the time got incorporated into the early church, and men actively opposed women in leadership in order to further their own ambitions. If this is true, then Christianity is sexist. So this is me sort of looking at an argument that's against the statement and then criticising it, saying that actually for me this doesn't work, because to say that we know Jesus didn't intend women to be leaders, we don't know that. We know that all of his disciples were men, but that probably says more about the social structures of the time than it does about what Jesus actually thought about gender and sexism. Okay, so let's get to the end. In conclusion, the fact that there is even an ongoing debate in 2023 at all about whether women can be leaders in the church is, for me, a clear indication of sexism. Whilst individuals and groups may have made huge strides towards equality over the last 100 years, the fact that this is even still debated shows that there are deep-rooted problems. Some problems are theological, like the status of the apostolic succession, and others stem from scripture, but the evidence suggests to me that Daphne Hampson is right to argue that Christianity cannot shake off its patriarchal baggage. The status of women in Jesus' time is reflected to an extent in the way that women are treated in certain branches of the church today, and I can see no other explanation for that than sexism. Okay, so I've given a little shout out to Hampson there to show that, I've understood her argument and that I can use it to support what I'm saying. But you'll notice that I'm not going into really any depth at all about what Hampson says, because I don't have to here. I'm using the wording of the question to help me. So ongoing debate. My conclusion is basically saying the fact that there still is an ongoing debate, the fact that this isn't settled, shows that at least some of it must be about sexism. Now, I'm female. I'm very much in favour of gender equality. I'm a feminist, and that's reflected in how I've written this essay. If you're not really any of those things, you might write this essay completely differently, and that's absolutely fine. What I'm trying to show you here is not really about this is the right way to do this essay. I'm just trying to show you some strategies for how to structure it, some phrases that can help get your AO2 in so that it's not all just knowledge, and a few tips on wording and length. I'm not trying to preach anything to anybody. You could just as easily write this essay completely from the other side, say that Christianity is not sexist at all the prohibitions on women are justified in different ways. That would be absolutely cool, because you'd probably get the same amount of marks for it. They're not interested, the markers, particularly in what you think. They're interested in the quality of your argument, whatever that argument is. So as long as you do a good argument supported by evidence, backed up by the knowledge you've got, you will be great. Okay? But remember your conclusions. Conclusions are super important because it proves that you've answered the question. Okay, hope that's helped. Take it easy, and I'll see you next time.